It was Jonathan Gronli in the Ronald Williams Library at Northeastern Illinois University. Today we have a NEIU Libraries Roundtable discussion on intellectual freedom. With me, I have Stephen Harris, the Dean of the Libraries, Mary Thill, Reference Coordinator and Humanities Librarian, and Ed Remus, the Social Sciences Librarian. We're doing this in part because Banned Books Week at the time that this is being recorded is coming up next week. At the time that this is releasing, hopefully it will be the Monday of Banned Books Week. So the first question, just to get us started, as it is going to be Banned Books Week, is what was your first professional experience dealing with book challenges or banned books? In the case that you don't have personal experiences dealing with book challenges, how about any challenges regarding the acquisition and weeding of certain books?
I'll jump in first, I guess. And I would say, and this is probably true for all of us, that we don't have a lot of direct experience with actual challenges in academic libraries. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit in a moment. But I just wanted to say that early in my career, I worked on several research projects about sort of enumerating instances of challenged books. And one of those, part of our methodology was to look at a publication called Newsletter on Intellectual Freedom, which comes from the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom, and is a monthly publication. I think it no longer exists, was published from about 1952 until about 2015. But our methodology, back up a bit, in that newsletter, part of what they do is report incidents of challenges. So every month there's like dozens of reported incidents, which they gather by looking at newspapers from around the U.S. So there's definitely probably some sampling bias in that data. But the research project I worked on was to look at the 1980s and actually look at every issue of the Newsletter on Intellectual Freedom and every report of a challenged book incident, and then just kind of like record the demographics, so to speak, the data, code the data about what those incidents were about. And all of that is long and short to say that academic libraries are not very often sites of challenged books. It's a lot more frequent that it is public schools or K through 12 school libraries that are challenged, and it typically has to do with people outside the school thinking that this book is not appropriate for children, kind of thing. That said, the one sort of incident that I remember, and maybe I don't remember all the details of it, but I recollect getting an angry letter from a student at a university where I worked, pondering why we had this Noam Chomsky book, and I forget which book it was. It might have been Manufacturing Consent. Wondering why we had that book and we didn't have some other book by a conservative commentator. And, basically my response to that was, that Noam Chomsky is in high demand, but in point of fact, our library does have, I think the complainer in the letter said something like, you librarians are all a bunch of liberals and all you do is collect liberal stuff. So my response was just to point out that we did in fact have books by conservatives, including Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter and
Bill O'Reilly.
yeah, Glenn, whatever Glenn's name is. And so that was sort of the one incident that I have. But this sort of reminds me of another incident at a different place that I worked. One of our acquisitions methods was sort of a purchase on demand plan. And the nature of that was when someone requested an interlibrary loan, it was actually deemed to be more cost effective and quicker to order the book through Amazon and just deliver the book to the person through Amazon. And in the course of that, one of the books we ended up getting, we purchase it through Amazon and just give it to the person without even cataloging it, with the expectation that they would return it, and then we'd catalog it and put it in the collection. And one of the books that we ended up getting was a Glenn Beck book. And there was a librarian who was enraged that happened, that we would end up with a book by Glenn Beck, but through this process of purchase on demand that the library had implemented, that we're going to end up with just a bunch of junk in the library collection. And again, my response to that was to run out the spreadsheet list of all the books that we had purchased through that program, which demonstrated that people were actually pretty interested in scholarly materials and not that interested in politics. So anyway,
Nice.
That's my experience with
Nice.
challenge books.
Now I do know that Ed has an interesting story from his time before becoming an academic librarian, when you were working in a private school, correct?
Yeah, that's right. The year after I graduated college, I worked as the library supervisor at a Catholic high school in the Chicago area. I won't say which one. But when I started, this is actually before I went to library school, so I really didn't have training. And I started out by asking the students which fiction books they'd like to read for leisure, and I bought some new books, including the Harry Potter series, based on their recommendations. And I also bought some graphic novels with social justice themes that I wanted the students to think about. I remember one of the books was Howard Zinn's A People's History of American Empire. And not long after that, 2 religion teachers came forward to challenge my book selections. One, interestingly, was a religion teacher that I had had as my own high school religion teacher at a different school years earlier. And so I knew that he was broadly neoconservative in outlook, and he was troubled by what he took to be my attempt to proselytize a particular political viewpoint through my choice of the graphic novels. The other religion teacher was less concerned about politics, but I think she was concerned about heresy, if you will. She saw Harry Potter as promoting witchcraft in a way that was contrary to Catholic religious teaching. So they first approached me individually with their concerns, and after I indicated that I didn't see any good reason to take the books off the shelves, in fact, I think the Harry Potter books were checked out at that time in any case. The graphic novels were not, which is maybe indicative. But then these teachers went over my head and complained to the principal about my book selections. And fortunately, when I met with the principal, I found her to be much more libertarian in spirit. I think she was simply happy that the students were reading, that the library was functioning. She was satisfied by my explanation that the graphic novels would teach students about aspects of the world and aspects of history in an engaging format. And she sort of rolled her eyes at the suggestion that Harry Potter was corrupting the souls of the youth in the school. So in the end, it was a victory for the freedom to read. But I think that the nature of those challenges does say something about the nature of a lot of attempts to ban books in our society more generally. I think those challenges were coming from places that are with us still, and that librarians, especially public and school librarians, continue to face.
And Mary, I know that you brought up to me that you don't necessarily have experience with dealing with banned books or book challenges themselves, but you did say that you were dealing with challenges to deacquisitions and weeding options. Could you speak to that a little?
Sure, although I don't know that it's entirely on point. The challenges that I usually face as a librarian tend to be from faculty who want to hold on to certain pieces of, let's say, literary criticism, for example. And I maybe have practical considerations for wanting to remove those pieces. Maybe it's just a question of space. Maybe it's how often the item has been checked out. Maybe its availability more widely through the Hathi Trust. So that's sort of more what I've experienced. I've been really lucky that at Northeastern Illinois University, faculty and students alike have been very supportive of my collection decisions.
Part of what that suggests to me is, we always think that people accept and recognize our professional knowledge and training, but that's not always the case. That oftentimes our professionalism or our knowledge and training might be called into question, especially when talking about what is or is not in the collection.
Very true, very true. So the next question that I have is, if you have dealt with a book challenge, how did you approach weighing the value of the challenge itself versus the challenged material? And Mary, you already kind of covered the second half. So if you feel like you have anything more to add, feel free to. But I am guessing Stephen and Ed might have a bit more material on this.
Go for it, Ed.
Yeah, well, following up on the anecdote that I just gave, I would say that looking back, I am proud to have defended the place of Harry Potter and Howard Zinn on the library shelves. But I think that after over a decade of experience working in libraries, I would do some things differently today. I think I would ask those religion teachers to come up with a short list of books that they think would be more reflective of the political and spiritual values they were trying to cultivate in students. And I would buy those books, or at least some of them, and I would put them on shelf next to Harry Potter and Howard Zinn. And, in the same section, I would give those books the same treatment, because I think that on the one hand, as a librarian, I don't agree with any attempt to ban any book for any reason. But I think that librarians can, in good conscience, respond to book ban attempts by making an effort to include books on our shelves which reflect the values and the perspectives of the would-be book banners. And I think that in doing that, in making that attempt to say, no, it's not going to be either or, but it can be both and, I think we broaden rather than narrow the range of books and ideas available to our readers. And I think we do so while still respecting the autonomy of readers to choose books as they see fit and to make up their own minds about what they read in those books. So I would handle that situation a little bit differently today. I think that sometimes challenges do come from a place of people feeling that their worldviews, their ideas, and their practices are not sufficiently represented in the collection. And whatever we might personally think of those practices, I think, again, we can in good conscience say, all right, well, tell us what you would like to see, and we'll make an effort to include it.
There's, so much subtlety here. When I was in library school, I recollect at one point expressing to one of my library school faculty members that I was really interested in collection development. And he jokingly said, "Oh, you want to be a censor?" Meaning that in the course of collection development, you're making decisions about what will and what will not be in the collection. And, to an outsider, that those decisions may seem like they are arbitrary, or they may seem like they are motivated by your personal politics. And so I think, it's a real trick. I mean, it's sort of incumbent on our library education that we learn the differences between censorship and collection development. But it's sort of incumbent on the individual to sort of identify the rationale for why materials are in the collection, and the rationale generally ought not to be your own personal viewpoint. And it may be that it is an attempt to represent a range of things, and I think I'll have something to say about that on subsequent questions. But it may be an attempt to represent a range of ideas. But within a university library, it can also be an attempt to serve a curriculum. So one of the big reasons why something is in the collection is that it serves the curriculum. Now, we ought to have books in the library that do more than just serve the curriculum, that are there to stimulate the interest or spur the passion, or, satisfy an urge to find out something from anybody on campus, I think is a noble endeavor.
Okay. Mary, as I said, if you have anything to add. If you don't, we can move on to the next question, but I have a feeling the next ones you'll have quite a bit to contribute to. So if we're all ready to move on.
On to question 3, or whatever number it is.
Exactly. Question 3. How should a university like our own build a collection that is representative of the full campus community? For example, Northeastern Law is a largely liberal and progressive campus, but we do have conservative students. While we do have a lot of students who are citizens, we do have undocumented students, we do have DACA recipients, we do have international students. How do we build a collection to represent the whole?
Well, I'll jump in since I hung back before. So I'll say that my point of view is maybe not quite as liberal as Ed's, in that I don't think that I would feel comfortable promising someone who has a particular perspective that I'm going to put books from that perspective in the collection necessarily. Now, what I mean by that is that, Ed's example, that's works of fiction, right? So I could see having, different kinds of works of fiction representing different worldviews. But I think that the internet already does like a fantastic job of sort of very democratically incorporating many different points of view, many different ways of writing out history and so forth. And I think that sometimes what people turn to the library for is for a place where they're going to find high quality materials, right? In other words, like Stephen was saying, as librarians, we are in a sense, by making a decision to purchase this and not that, right? We are censoring too. And so what I would say is that the key is to not censor along, for instance, political ideology. There are high quality materials that have progressive liberal viewpoints, and there are high quality materials that have more conservative viewpoints, right? And what is high quality will really depend a lot, for instance, on the context of the discipline, right? So for instance, in the sciences, there may be a little bit less tolerance, right, for alternate facts, for instance. And as a librarian, I'm not going to promise that, something that was written in somebody's basement, right, is going to necessarily be something that I'm going to devote library funds to purchasing. They can access those things freely on the internet if that's what they're interested in doing. So I think what I try to do is I try to think about, like Stephen was saying, what are my criteria for what's a high quality item? what's the rationale behind this collection, and how to make sure that I'm defining high quality in ways that are fair and relatively unbiased or value neutral. So for instance, like in my research, I have something called the Y method, right? Where we're looking at author credential, we're looking at editorial process, we're looking at publication purpose and where things are published. And, if the standard is that we need things that go through very rigorous peer review, then I might look for things along the conservative spectrum that have gone through more rigorous peer review, and then likewise things that have gone through more rigorous peer review along something, from a different perspective. And similarly, I think that academia is biased towards itself, right? That we tend to sort of want to be in the echo chamber of academia, where we're just talking to other academics. And so, maybe opening ourselves up to different kinds of authorities, people who maybe have lived experience. I think that that's something that we should be open to as well. But to be open to everything, I think it's not desirable or possible.
Yeah, I would amplify that point in several ways. And, I had been thinking about lots of points on this question, and, as we've been talking, some of those have escaped my mind. But, for example, the notion of the different areas that are ideas that we might serve, I see no particular reason why we should have, for example, anti-vaxxer political diatribes in our collection. I can see us having books about the phenomenon of anti-vaxxing, but there are lots of books out there that are based on misinformation and false premises in that area. And, I feel no compulsion to represent those points of view generally. And I would say, for a collection of our size, it's a complicated thing. And your question didn't say this, but, the notion of representing all points of view, even for big libraries, is actually approaching an impossibility, because if you're really representing all points of view, you would have to have all books, and no library can have that. But a library like ours, which is extremely small relative to large research collections or large archival collections, we have no hope of even necessarily representing a wide swath of points of view. We are quite limited both in our collection budget, but in our available space as well. So I think by its very nature, we have to kind of arrive at an idea of what level of sampling are we comfortable with, and how are we directing our sampling in order to arrive at the decisions, sort of what I've already said. What's the basis for us picking this very small subset of the scholarly record to add to our collection? And so, just to say, we are always a small subset. We are always a sample of ideas. So, what's the rationale for the ideas that we chose to represent? And I still feel like, the safest bet there, and even this, is perhaps where it's difficult to arrive at, but the safest bet is that we're serving, the research or the curriculum of the university, but also we're serving the research agendas of the faculty as we know them. on campus.
Yeah, I would actually agree with everything that's been said. You know, as Mary mentioned, I've come to approach these questions from a kind of strongly liberal or civil libertarian spirit. But at the same time, I think when it comes down to practical decision making at a university library, I think we all essentially have are in agreement on how these decisions should be made. You know, the particular anecdote I mentioned, as Mary correctly pointed out, you know, that's relating to fiction, and it's in a different context. It's a leisure reading collection at a high school library, right? So if I think about the equivalent challenge today at Northeastern or any university library, you know, I think I would respond by saying, well, we have Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn on the shelf, and if you're interested in differing perspectives, let's find scholars who have published through university presses and or peer-reviewed journals who have written thoroughgoing, principled accounts for why American imperialism and hegemony was a necessity in the 20th century. Whether or not I agree with those accounts, they exist. They're out there, actually, a lot of them. Especially around 20 years ago, there were a lot of them published. And so I would just want to make sure that those were also available to students, especially in the event of a challenge. And likewise, in terms of issues around secularism and religion, I would say, well, you know, let's see if we can find some works by a theologian who give a very compelling account of the truth of faith in some sense. So I think those, and again, I would apply the same standards that Mary rightly mentioned. I think that's very important. I think that also with respect to your question, raising these categories of progressive and conservative, I think that there are some books which aim to represent differing perspectives in the context of a single edited volume. I do try to collect, for example, books in the Opposing Viewpoint series published by Greenhaven Press, which sort of curate very sharp, condensed takes, if you will, arguments with evidence presented by experts and scholars coming from differing points of view on controversial topics. You know, the one other thing I wanted to mention, it's sort of a big idea that your question raised in my mind, is that the meanings of progressivism and conservatism change over time. And so, for example, on our shelves, we have books that were published 20 or 30 years ago, and I've weeded some of them. I've had to look through them and decide whether to keep them, and in some cases, I've decided to keep them. In other cases, I've decided they no longer meet the needs of the collection. But these books, some of them articulate incisive criticisms of global trade agreements like NAFTA, as well as of international political economic organizations like the European Union, and to your point, even to some of the labor and migration flows and regimes that were part of these globalist, if you will, enterprises, right? And so when these books were first published, this was in the context of the ultra-globalization movement, for example, the 1999 Seattle WTO protests. Their vantage point would have been considered broadly progressive. But interestingly, as you could say the neoliberal order has come into crisis over the past decade, it's actually been more the avowed conservatives and rightists that have taken up at least some of the same critiques of, say, NAFTA and the EU that were formerly considered progressive. So I remember holding these books on my hand in our library and thinking, well, what am I really looking at? Is this progressive? Is it conservative? And it's an interesting question, right? The meanings of these change over time. And, you know, likewise, another example that kind of pertains to some of the research being done in our history department right now, books arguing against government restrictions on firearms would traditionally be considered politically conservative, right? Yet more recently, in tracing the origins of mass incarceration and of patterns of racial disparity in criminal sentencing, some very progressive and activist scholars have begun to argue that things like mandatory minimum sentences for the illegal possession of firearms have contributed to these problems, right? And these very problematic realities. So, and their critiques tend to dovetail in some interesting ways with what would have been formerly considered a conservative viewpoint on protecting Second Amendment rights, right? So, so these categories are up for grabs, and as our society and our politics change, the meanings, the political inflections of the books on our shelves will change also. And so if you keep certain books on historical and political topics on the shelf of your library long enough, you may find that they're no longer conservative or they're no longer progressive. And that's, I think, one of the very interesting aspects of our work.
Fair enough.
And one
I
more
was going
thing.
to add one thing to say, I think area that Mary works in, fiction, is perhaps more fraught than many subject areas, but politics, political science as well might be a little fraught, but a lot of academic disciplines, I mean, there are a range of views within the academic discipline, and you might construe some as progressive and some as conservative, but it's probably not that clear cut in many academic disciplines.
And Jonathan, we didn't touch on the point about representing DACA recipients and international students and so forth. I do want to say that when it comes to representing underserved communities, I think that we have work to do. I think that we have tried to consciously collect things that represent the campus, but I do think that that's like an area where we have work to do. And for instance, I was saying I don't have a lot of examples of people challenging what I've purchased, but they have challenged what I've weeded. And recently when I was doing deacquisitions, I had, a column with sort of my usual criteria, in terms of how often was this checked out and is this available online elsewhere? But then I also had a column now that said, does it represent or does it support DEI? Right? Because my feeling was that maybe something wasn't checked out because it kind of got lost in sort of, 10 books by, pardon me, but dead white men, right? And then there's maybe this like one slim volume. And I thought, yes, I'm going to take out, these 10 outdated books, but rather than taking out this one slim volume, I'm going to hold on to it and see if in the streamlined collection, it's going to get some usage. So definitely it's a work in progress, I think, representing all of the communities on campus in the collection.
Right. It's sort of like dealing with, long history of white supremacy that went into building library collections. It's like you don't really have to do that much work to represent, white America. It's already in the collection. And so I think that we have a lot of work to do to even represent at the percentages that those populations occur in Chicago, representing what are traditionally underserved collections or underserved populations. And there are not even minority populations in our neighborhood of Chicago. They are majority populations.
All right. Before we move on, for our listeners, viewers, we do have the option of trying to request books from other schools and from other libraries. So if we don't have it, it's not like you can't get it. You have access to iShare and WorldShare. But the next question is, what do you feel is the role of the library in fostering intellectual freedom, but also both information literacy and academic honesty? Basically, how deeply should we approach teaching students on how to vet the overall value and trustworthiness of the resources they might try to use?
Who's going first? I'll go. I think it's vitally important for us, sort of the core of our curriculum, as it were, is to teach people that there is a huge range of information in the world. And some of that information all of that information typically is created to serve some particular point of view or to serve some agenda. And I think, it's not necessarily our job to tell the students which materials they should pick to use or tell the students which materials are reliable. It's our job to arm them with skills where they can make that determination themselves. And the answer to those questions might, in fact, depend on what their agenda is and what message they're trying to generate. And, if it's in the coursework, of course, they have to defend their agenda and their point of view to their professor. But ultimately, it comes down to a point of what do they want to say and what's the materials that support that, and what materials support that are reliable materials that are legitimate expressions of points of view or information that support their point of view or agenda. So I think that we have a big responsibility to teach that skill. And Mary might have more to say about that.
Yeah, I was about to say, I do know that this is one of Mary's specialty projects, so I have a feeling she'd have a lot to say.
So yes, it's true. I mean, most of my own research centers around teaching students how to evaluate sources. And I mentioned in a previous answer, one thing that we've developed is something called the why method. It asks students to look at a piece of information and try to understand what authority the authors are claiming, what editorial process the item has undergone, and then finally for what reasons the piece was published. And I think that I can't say enough for doing things that are value neutral, right? Like that, right? There's no such thing as good sources and bad sources necessarily. There's just sources where people might be more authoritative than to speak in that area than others. And students are going to have to make up their own minds about who they consider authorities in different contexts. Or the faculty is going to have to lead them, right, in making decisions about who they trust, about whether or not this source is from a trustworthy place. In the past, librarians taught something called the CRAP method, right? And one of the things that we asked students to do was to assess whether or not pieces were accurate. And honestly, I think we're learning now, especially in sort of this post-truth era, right? It's so hard to know what is accurate and what's not accurate unless you've done the study yourself, right? So instead, the question is, who do you trust? Who do you trust to convey something honestly? Who do you trust to have experience in the area? And I think as librarians, that's one of the most important things that we can do is to prepare students for a really complex information environment that they're going to be going into. When I analyzed student papers, NEIU student papers from English 102, I found that almost half of their sources came from the internet in ways that they really wouldn't have had any contact with the library. And that was for, a research-based graded assignment. And the fact of the matter is that we're all just, we're mostly on Google. Most of our lives we're on Google, and we're trying to make sense of what we find there. And we don't have friendly librarians to make the selections for us. And that's a good thing and that's a bad thing, right? And so I think preparing students to be their own librarians and make their own decisions is it's really vitally important.
Anything to add, Ed?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that it's useful to think about the availability of books on library shelves on the one hand and information literacy education on the other hand as being vitally interrelated. I have, again, I'm afraid it's a non-university library anecdote, but I think it sort of reveals a broader principle. My first public library job involved working with a librarian who had been a branch manager for many years in a working class community of Chicago, and she was essentially in her retirement working part-time. I remember being really struck when she told me that the library would keep copies of Mein Kampf on shelf, in part because young people would be instructed by their parents, many of whom had served in the Second World War, to read the book so that they could understand the nature of fascism, which they opposed. And so, there you have an example of someone essentially getting a kind of education, right, in critical thinking and information literacy, and being able to critically evaluate a source, and in a way to need to know it and to be familiar with it, but not to support it or to be swayed by it, right? And so that example made me think that if one is able, at the level of high school teachers, high school curriculum, high school libraries, high school librarians, as well as university curriculum and librarians like ourselves, and as well as the faculty here at the university, if what's happening with young people and with students in their interactions with all of those different teachers is that they're learning to critically evaluate resources, then there almost is no such thing as a book that's dangerously misguiding to have on shelf, right? But if that's not happening, if that information literacy instruction, if that critical thinking pedagogy is not happening, then suddenly people can say, oh, well, you have this or that book, you have this or that viewpoint on your shelf. What is someone going to think if they pick it up and read it, right? The presumption there is that they haven't been taught to kind of think for themselves and to think critically. So I think that's why our work is vitally important, because it's the work that ensures that we can have sometimes very dangerous ideas and perspectives represented on shelf without the result being in fact dangerous.
All right.
One other thing I wanted to loop back to, is sort of the nature of the way libraries are run in regards intellectual freedom. And that is a component of intellectual freedom is always a right to privacy, and the notion of my personal conscience is not necessarily a thing that anybody has a right to know but myself. And so to go along with that, it is really vital for libraries that the reading that people do in the libraries and the information that they seek out, that is their business and it is nobody else's business. And we're standing in the middle of that because we keep the records of what they've checked out in order to, be able to remind them to bring that book back. We know what they've looked at. We know what they've read or ostensibly have read if they've checked it out of the library. But it is really a core of librarian principle that we don't share that information. And ultimately that people feel comfortable with the notion of what happens in the library stays in the library, as it were, that, what I make use of in the library, nobody else is going to know about unless I express it myself. It's my prerogative to tell people, and it's my prerogative to include that information in the paper that I write for my class. But it's not anybody's prerogative, and definitely not the library's prerogative, to force that information out into the public.
All right. Anything else to add before we move on? Nope. Okay. So the next question is kind of along the same lines, but a little more directed towards just how to help preserve the intellectual freedom as well as fostering open discussions. So what more can libraries, including our own, but overall, what more can libraries do to help preserve the intellectual freedom to read, write, and research, as well as fostering open discussions about the value of books and other materials being challenged?
I feel like step one is have a library collection. That there are books available for people to read. And, I don't necessarily make any case for them being physical versus electronic or whatever. But that information is available is kind of step one of that. But I think that also, to me, this is something that I find interesting about librarianship, is that we do various programmatic things to sort of bring attention to things that we think are interesting, things that we think are cool. And we do this in a lot of different ways. I mean, the cafe collection, the popular reading collection, is sort of arrayed in a way that's intended to be attractive, to look something like a bookstore, I guess. And I think that, and it's in a comfy space, is just suggesting to people, we have interesting things here that maybe we want to take a break from your university life and just read one of these popular books, I think is one marketing thing that we do for the idea of books, that they're fun and interesting. But I think there are a lot of other things that we do, and Ed has been involved in quite a few of these, where we stimulate conversation about ideas and about books. And the whole point is that, having the book on the shelf is one thing, but, sort of like thinking about the social life of ideas and figuring out ways that libraries can be part of that social life, can be both the location of, but also sort of the promoter of, or the curator of conversations about ideas and conversations about books.
Yeah, absolutely. When I worked in public libraries, I organized a few such events that featured differing perspectives, sort of qualified in some sense expert speakers coming from differing perspectives on controversial topics. I hosted 2 debates. One was on healthcare reform, and it included 3 doctors representing 3 different organizations, one in favor of Obamacare, one in favor of national single-payer healthcare, and one in favor of a more establishment Republican Party kind of free market-based healthcare system. And we also hosted a debate on the minimum wage in Chicago that featured a kind of neoclassical, neoliberal, libertarian economist, someone who is formerly affiliated with the Communist Party in Mexico, who organizes low-wage, undocumented migrant laborers here in Chicago, and then a kind of centrist Democratic Party alderman here in Chicago, right? So 3 different perspectives on that topic of the minimum wage. And since coming to NEIU, we've organized also a few such events. One was on reparations for Black Americans, one was on the 2016 US presidential election, and one was on political realignment in the United States and globally in this kind of crisis of neoliberalism. And I will make an announcement. We don't have a date and time quite yet, but we are organizing 2 more such events to take place this semester, one on the topic of race and the Second Amendment, which I alluded to earlier, and the other on a political science topic of Congress and the separation of powers. So stay tuned for those, but that is something that we try to do in a more active way, right? Featuring, hosting and organizing events and programs featuring speakers with differing perspectives on controversial topics.
In addition to the really important programmatic work that we do, I think another thing that libraries can contribute to intellectual freedom is our support for the open access movement. One of the daily realities of being a librarian is that we have finite funds to try to make available to our students information that's behind paywalls, books that have to be purchased. And, the same academics who are producing that information on behalf of our universities, they're having to sell it back to our universities to benefit the private sector. So I think that if we truly want true freedom of ideas and high quality ideas, as I was speaking of earlier, I think that continuing to encourage our own faculty, our own students to support the open access movement is critical.
Well, that is all of the questions that we have, and we actually came up almost up to the time limit I was setting for it. So very nicely done. Thank you for participating, and thank you for this great discussion.
Great conversation. Thanks, Ed and Mary and Jonathan.
Okay.
Thank you, John, for organizing this.
Thanks all, and yes, thank you, Jonathan.
I was happy to do it. I thought it was the opportune time to have a discussion like this and have it be available to the public through our social media. So thanks again and have a good afternoon.
Happy Banned Books Week.